JSX. JSX, or JavaScript XML, is an extension to the JavaScript language syntax. Similar in appearance to HTML, JSX provides a way to structure component rendering using syntax familiar to many developers. React components are typically written using JSX, although they do not have to be. JSX is similar to another extension syntax created by Facebook for PHP called XHP. React embraces the fact that rendering logic is inherently coupled with other IE logic, how events are handled, how the state changes over time, and how the data is prepared for display. Instead of artificially separating technologies by putting markup and logic in separate files, React separates concerns with loosely coupled units called components that contain both. We will come back to components in a further section, but if you're not yet comfortable putting markup in JS, this talk might convince you otherwise. React doesn't require using JSX. But most people find it helpful as a visual aid when working with IE inside the JavaScript code. It also allows React to show more useful error and warning messages. We split JSX over multiple lines for readability. While it isn't required, when doing this, we also recommend wrapping it in parentheses to avoid the pitfalls of automatic semicolon insertion. JSX is an expression too. After compilation, JSX expressions become regular JavaScript function calls and evaluate to JavaScript objects. This means that you can use JSX inside of if statements and for loops, assign it to variables, accept it as arguments, and return it from functions. Specifying attributes with JSX. You may use quotes to specify string literals as attributes. You may also use curly braces to embed a JavaScript expression in an attribute. Don't put quotes around curly braces when embedding a JavaScript expression in an attribute. You should either use quotes or curly braces, but not both in the same attribute. Warning. Since JSX is closer to JavaScript than to HTML, React DOM uses CamelCase property naming convention instead of HTML attribute names. For example, class becomes classname in JSX, and tabindex becomes tabindex. Specifying children with JSX. If a tag is empty, you may close it immediately with greater than, like XML. JSX prevents injection attacks. It is safe to embed user input in JSX. By default, React DOM escapes any values embedded in JSX before rendering them. Thus it ensures that you can never inject anything that's not explicitly written in your application. Everything is converted to a string before being rendered. This helps prevent XSS attacks. JSX represents objects. Babel compiles JSX down to React.createElement calls. Architecture beyond HTML. The basic architecture of React applies beyond rendering HTML in the browser. For example, Facebook has dynamic charts that render to tags, and Netflix and PayPal use universal loading to render identical HTML on both the server and client. React does not attempt to provide a complete application library. It is designed specifically for building user interfaces and therefore does not include many of the tools some developers might consider necessary to build an application. This allows the choice of whichever libraries the developer prefers to accomplish tasks such as performing network access or local data storage. Common patterns of usage have emerged as the library matures. Unidirectional data flow. to support React's concept of unidirectional data flow. The Flux architecture was developed as an alternative to the popular model, view, controller architecture. Flux features actions which are sent through a central dispatcher to a store, and changes to the store are propagated back to the view. When used with React, this propagation is accomplished through component properties. Since its conception, Flux has been superseded by libraries such as Redux and Mobx. Flux can be considered a variant of the observer pattern. A React component under the Flux architecture should not directly modify any props passed to it, but should be passed callback functions that create actions which are sent by the dispatcher to modify the store. The action is an object whose responsibility is to describe what has taken place. For example, an action describing one user following another might contain a user id, a target user id, and the type user followed another user. The stores, which can be thought of as models, can alter themselves in response to actions received from the dispatcher. This pattern is sometimes expressed as properties flow down, actions flow up. Many implementations of Flux have been created since its inception, perhaps the most well-known being Redux, which features a single store, often called a single source of truth. Future development. Project status can be tracked via the core team discussion forum. However, major changes to React go through the future of React repository issues and pull requests. This enables the React community to provide feedback on new potential features, experimental APIs and JavaScript syntax improvements.